to the video. So if you're watching this, you're watching the replay of a conversation between me, Heidi Silvestre, and Théodore Tallent, who is a PhD student at Sciences Po, specializing in environmental policies, in the acceptabilities of climate policies, and Théodore is also an ambassador to the EU Climate Pact. So today we're going to be talking about geoengineering. I mean, this is a topic that is scaring me a little, but I'm becoming quite passionate about it, and I really think that everyone should know about what's happening in the world of geoengineering today. So before adding Théodore to this conversation, I just want to remind you that we're only going to be live for the next 30 minutes sharp. And if you have any questions, please make sure you use the little question mark thing below. Otherwise, we really cannot see any questions in the comments. They just go by too quickly. So let me add Théodore. Thank you so much for the request. I wrote this fantastic op-ed in Le Monde a few weeks ago, and I really wanted to have a conversation with him. So tonight, we're definitely in luck. Hello, Théodore. How are you?
Hello. Good, and you?
So good to have you. Well, thank you so very much for your time. I must say I'm very excited about the conversation this evening. Really curious about the world of geoengineering and its consequences. But before we dive into the topic, can you please introduce yourself to everyone? And can you also tell us why you're so passionate about geoengineering?
Okay, so first, thank you very much, Heidi, for the invitation. Yes, so I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Sciences Po in Paris, but also running some research in partnership with the University of Cambridge. I've been specializing in environmental policy for quite some time now, and I'm dedicating my PhD to these issues. I came to study a bit the topic of geoengineering because, as you said before, I'm focusing a lot on citizens' attitudes regarding climate policies, climate change, environmental issues, etc. And when I was doing this, I started to see that there is we have some issue right now regarding technology, and I think a lot of citizens are trying to believe that our fate is going to come from technology. And so I started exploring this, and I came in contact with the issue of geoengineering, which we're going to discuss today. Quite a frightening one, but something we really need to understand in the future of policymaking.
Yeah, totally. And it's funny to talk about geoengineering that is hoping to solve, we'll dive deeper into this, but one of our biggest problems, which is climate change that originally comes from the problem created by technology. But before we dive really deep into the topics and concretely what geoengineering can look like, I did this little poll on my Instagram in preparation for this live, and I asked my followers, how much do you know about geoengineering? Please tell me, do you know a lot about it, or have you never heard of geoengineering? 50% of the people replied that they didn't know what geoengineering was. So can you please take us into the world of geoengineering and in very simple terms and tell us, why we should care?
Of course, I'm going to make it simple because also I'm not a physicist, so I don't know everything about it. But in broad term, geoengineering could be defined as any deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth system that is trying to limit the effect of climate change. So it means you have two main types, which are solar and carbon geoengineering. The main one maybe that some people know is carbon geoengineering, which we sometimes call greenhouse gas removal. And I think if we say that, you start to see that, I think we all have a sense of what's happening here. So it's basically any natural or man-made intervention designed to capture CO2 or greenhouse gases. Here on the discussion, I think we're gonna focus a lot on technological carbon capture, which means any use of a technology that is capturing CO2 from the atmosphere or directly from a plant to store it in the ground or in some sort of material. But carbon geoengineering could also be planting tree, because you're planting a tree, so it captures CO2. So you have natural form of geoengineering, which I think I'm gonna focus on this a little bit at the end. So this is the main type. You can just capture it, like in the air. The issue with this technology is that the CO2 is only less than 0.1% of the air around us. So you need a lot of energy to capture this CO2. You can also do it at a plant, which is a bit easier, but then you don't have all the CO2 that is around us. The other option, and I think this is probably the option that people don't really know about, but I think is the scariest, And also it's the most likely because carbon geoengineering is not really functioning right now. There are some tests, but it's not capturing at all anything close to what we would actually need to capture. The idea of solar geoengineering is actually a bit scary because it comes from the point that because we're emitting greenhouse gases, the Earth is warming. I think we all get this. The other thing that is warming the Earth is the sun. So the idea of solar geoengineering is instead of reducing greenhouse gases and hence reducing the warmth that we are creating, we're going to reflect part of the heat from the sun. And in doing so, we're going to decrease the temperature on Earth without having to do anything in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And to do this, you have several technologies. You can spray particles in the stratosphere, very high in the altitude, to reflect part of the sun. Or you could brighten the clouds above the sea, for example, so there is more light coming back to the atmosphere. I think we're going to come back a lot on this, but just to conclude, the main idea of geoengineering is to be corrective rather than preventive. Never reduce, the point is not to reduce greenhouse gas emission at first, is to limit the effect it has on our system.
Thank you very much for this summary. I think this is excellent and it really puts us in a good position to continue the conversation. But just to summarize very quickly, you've explained that there are two main types of geoengineering. One that is trying to reduce how much sunlight we get here on Earth, and another one that is about capturing greenhouse gases using different technologies. And my next question is, okay, some of these solutions sound pretty crazy, capturing greenhouse gases, although trees do that very well, as you explained. What sounds even crazier is partly blocking sunlight. Are we close to seeing these things happening? I have visited in Iceland one of these geothermal power plants that is capturing CO2 and storing it in the ground. So I kind of know that this is already happening. But what about, solar geoengineering? Are people actually working on this?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question because it's touching upon the main issue that we have in this, I think, discussion, that a lot of people are actually not even aware that it's happening. Carbon geoengineering, as you said, is actually, so we have had some projects for more than a decade because we all know that, greenhouse gases are the problem, so we may capture greenhouse gases. It's pretty obvious that there is a path here. The issues, as I said, is of course, they are implementing solutions, but it's not working large scale. So they are trying to put it in some plants somewhere. Some startups are right now trying to capture carbon from the air. The problem, as I said, that we are very, very, very far from the scale that we need. And it's actually very heavy technologies. So if you want to have enough technology to capture enough CO2, the amount of heavy technology you need is quite insane. But talking about solar geoengineering, this is actually what came first to my mind when I started looking into geoengineering, is the case of an American startup called Make Sunsets. And I think it's been a lot on the news right now. That's actually why I wrote an article on this. So it's a startup that decided 2 months ago to spray aerosol particles in the stratosphere to show to the world from a site in Mexico that they could send a balloon in the stratosphere, spray particles, and maybe that these particles could be a way to reflect part of the sunlight. They are not saying that it's working. What they are saying is that they are able to go in the stratosphere and spray particles. The problem with this is now, is it working? You have some research program trying to do this, to study if it's working. The US government actually started a research program a couple of months ago, trying to understand better solar geoengineering. Harvard University, for example, has a geoengineering program. So they are trying to better understand it, but we are still very, very far from at least even understanding what is happening with geoengineering. They are also running tests to brighten the clouds above the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which makes sense because, the barrier reef is going to disappear. So they are trying to do this. They've been doing I think they did a test in 2021. But anyway, we're not anywhere close to having this operational. But the academic debate is actually very much live these days because I think some people are trying to see this as an opportunity, whereas some, like me, are just saying like big alarm. This is a dangerous path.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, thank you for bringing us close to reality. I think it's very important to show people that, hey, there are so many people working on this behind the scenes. Some of the biggest universities in the world, as you said, have a program of geoengineering. And I must tell you, a few months ago, I was at this big conference in Iceland called Arctic Circle. I don't know if you know it, but it brings together, the academics of the Arctic, the businesses, the governments of the Arctic. And there was this amazing plenary session with the head of the British Antarctic Survey, the head of the Alfred Wegener Research Institute, the two most powerful polar research institutes in the world. And they were talking about the importance of reducing CO2 greenhouse gases at the very source. We need to mitigate in order to fight climate change. But there was a third person there who was in charge of the NSF polar programs. I can't remember her name, but she was talking about the melting of permafrost and the fact that this is going to impact the rest of the world. And as a solution, she had a talk that was 5 minutes long. In 5 minutes, she mentioned 3 times the importance to dive deep into solar geoengineering. And I think people couldn't really believe it in the room, including the people on stage. But I think it shows that in some countries like the US, with exactly what you said, this is a very serious research topic. And right now, what's quite scary is to see that there are literally billions of dollars going towards geoengineering. But people might wonder, why am I getting so, a little bit upset about this? What are the problems with geoengineering? I know the climate could be affected. I know it might divert the attention towards, what the main problem is. But can you walk us through the main issues and also maybe some positive things related to geoengineering? What are the pluses and the minuses?
So yeah, this is quite a scary story. At first, the pros and cons depends on the 2 types of geoengineering, as I say. I think it's not exactly the same approach to capture CO2 instead of mitigating, compared to just literally reflecting something that has been happening for billions of years, which is sunlight. So, of course, the general objectives of both technologies or solutions is technically, I think, the objective is quite positive. It's to, do what every eco-friendly person wants to do, which means mitigate, limit the effect of climate change. So on paper, these technologies could work if they were happening at large scale. They could reduce the impact of climate change, and solar geoengineering could actually even decrease the temperature. So you can even make the pledge to say, okay, let's just go back 1 degree Celsius less, and then we go back to pre-industrial time. So this is on paper. Then I think, so this is the positive part, but now 10 minutes on the negative part. For all these solutions, for both of them, I think first, I want to insist on giving a word of extreme caution for 3 main points. First, philosophically, I think it's really debatable whether we should play with the climate, with the Earth system like this, after all the damage we've done. Because as you said, for centuries, by adding 40 billions of tons of CO2 per year in the atmosphere, we are doing climate geoengineering. And I think it's not pretty great. So I don't know if we should keep doing this, or maybe we should start thinking there is another option. Then politically, because this is what interests me the most, I think there is a significant risk that these technologies are going to divert the attention and probably, have an adverse impact on current policies. Why should we bother to enact unpopular policies, ambitious one, difficult one, if you have a magic solution? But what happens if this solution doesn't work? Then we are screwed, if I can say. And then environmentally, one of the main problems with geoengineering is that it's only focusing on global warming. So it means what's happening with biodiversity. We're not touching upon anything about biodiversity, but the problem is if you come to the people and companies saying there is geoengineering, then in the mind of people, it could say like, okay, we're going to solve the environmental problem. But as we know, there are a lot of limits. It's not only climate, it's biodiversity, it's water, it's, air cycle, etc. So I think this is one of the main issues. And especially solar geoengineering can actually have an adverse impact on biodiversity. And this is something I want to focus on. Solar radiation management, which is the other name for solar geoengineering, can lead to biophysical negative impact. Valérie Masson-Delmotte, who is the co-director of the Group 1 of the IPCC, wrote a very long thread on Twitter. So if you want to have a lot of information on this, she's basing her tweets on the IPCC report. You can go there. But the main points are that solar geoengineering could potentially lead to local alteration of climate, modification of air and water flows, modification of weather patterns, and even modification of the rainfall system. So it means some places it could rain a lot, in some places it could stop raining. It could actually damage local ecosystems because ecosystems are being hurt by climate change. But what's happening if you are changing climate in another way around? Then maybe ecosystems are not going to be able to survive. And most importantly, and this is why I'm scared, and it's not, it's not that I'm against technologies, that this technology is crazy for one main point. is called termination shock. The problem with solar geoengineering is that you need to continuously maintain spraying particles to have the cooling effect. What happens if at some point we stop spraying particles because we don't have enough particles, because there is a war, I don't know. Any reason. I know a lot of pro geoengineering say that this is not legit, that actually we're never going to stop. What's happening if we stop? If we stop, suddenly all the heat from the sun is going to come, you're going to stop blocking part of it, and the climate could change dramatically in like 2 years. There is basically no ecosystem that can survive such a dramatic change. And so this is very dangerous. And on carbon geoengineering, there is also another problem, which is, of course, you're capturing the carbon, putting it in the soil, but then you need to monitor it for centuries. There is a British report published about this last year, and this is going to raise the risk of liability, hand it to the public after private interests have extracted their profits from this enterprise of capturing carbon. So we are increasing liability. I'm not sure this is the right path we are on.
Definitely a lot to unpack there, and really impressive list of pros and cons. And I hope that everybody was paying really close attention to what you were saying, because it's fantastic summary. But I want to add something, the fact that behind these projects, I don't know a single climatologist, a single glaciologist, a single, IPCC scientist who is behind these projects and who supports the work of solar radiation management or carbon sequestration and capture. These projects are being developed by engineers, hence the name geoengineering, and they see the climate as a very simple system. They see this climate as a system that you can fix, that can be tweaked in a way. But unfortunately, the climate is a perfect system. So if you want to add something or remove something, the consequences will be absolutely dramatic. And there's kind of a funny story here, because solar geoengineering is actually very similar to what volcanoes do, day in, day out. They spray particles in the atmosphere, and we know the consequences of this. As you said, it's acid rains, it changes the temperatures, which is, I guess, what solar engineers want. It can change the rain patterns. But something like that happened in the past over Europe. And this is a famous example of the Laki eruption in Iceland. I mean, Laki was a giant eruption in the 1780s, so a very long time ago. Imagine crazy explosive eruption, threw a lot of particles in the atmosphere. What happened? Well, the particles stayed there for quite many years. And the climate over Europe was dramatically challenged and changed. The temperatures went down. The crop yield just dropped down because there was not even sunlight, to produce good crops. And what's funny, and I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but in France, a few years later, there was a revolution because people didn't have enough to eat because the crops were so poor. So I think, we shouldn't see the climate in such a simple way. And I had a professor at school who would always say, you do not fix problems, you basically shift the problems. And this is very true when it comes to geoengineering. But I want to touch on maybe nature-based solutions. And I know this is kind of the counterpart of geoengineering, but there is another way of doing this, right? What about the trees you mentioned at the beginning, or wetlands or things like that? Why aren't people more attracted into promoting, nature-based solutions and trying to make sure that ecosystems that help us today are protected? What is so complicated about this?
So I think first, as you said, there is a very interesting point with geoengineering, is that it's been conceptualized by engineers and then private interest. So I think this is something we need to keep in mind, that these people are just looking at it, thinking, okay, we have too much, greenhouse gas emission. Let's just do something about it. There is too much warmth. Let's do something about it. Problem with nature-based solutions or any natural solutions is that they are, they need other skills. They imply people sometimes, because nature-based solutions are relying on local communities. They rely some knowledge that we might not have in our big universities. And also, I want to say something about these nature-based solutions. nature-based solutions are great because they can capture the carbon, or reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, biochar. You can also store carbon in biochar. Building with biomass, actually, or blue carbon habitat restoration. All of these techniques are capable of storing carbon technically. And this is actually, if we're to talk about the solutions, I think this is where we should invest crazy amount of money. The problem is that first, it's a different knowledge, a knowledge that we don't really have. When I talk to people about, the carbon, they always think about the trees. Trees are great, but we never talk about the ground. Like agriculture has the potential to store incredible amount of carbon. The problem is that we are being ruled by engineers. So it means when you're starting to talk about carbon sequestration in the soil or wetlands, peatlands, a wet forest, etc., these are other skills, and I think the people ruling our countries are not really aware of them. And then second, of course, these solutions are great, and I think we should really invest in this. But I also want to express, sadly, a word of caution on this. Although these solutions are natural, first, they follow the same logic of saying, okay, we can keep emitting and we're just going to store carbon. Actually, most big companies are doing this. They just keep emitting. Shell, Total, spend some money trying to capture carbon through planting trees because it seems cool to plant trees. So first, this is the same logic. Instead of mitigating, we're just compensating. And second, there is a very interesting report actually published yesterday on the bad practices of the world's leading carbon standard, which is called Vera. It's a carbon standard used by Disney, Shell, Gucci, among others. And what this report is showing is that these companies are paying a lot of money to Vera to offset their emission by planting trees. But this report shows that more than 90% of the amount of offset credits that went to wet forest, to rainforest, let's say, are likely to be phantom credits, they say, and that they don't represent real carbon reduction. So what it says is, of course, maybe a bit of a pessimistic note, but it means that, of course, we need to invest crazy amount of money and effort in nature-based solutions, in natural carbon storing, but we also need to be, realistic about the situation. And in most cases, we are creating phantom credits where we don't actually compensate the emissions. And sometimes we actually indeed plant trees, but then the year after we have a big fire and then the trees are destroyed. And then the compensation was taken into account in the carbon balance of a company, but in reality, there was no compensation. So I think the message is mitigation, mitigation, mitigation.
Absolutely. Mitigation, mitigation, mitigation. This is the way. When I started reading the study last night, The Guardian published a very long article about it. I was like, this was born to happen. That, these carbon offsets are very attractive, but do they actually work? Well, the study proves that it's not that good. And I don't know if you know that Juice Media, which is, produces these short videos, really funny videos about climate that are really based in science. They had a video saying, well, trees burn, trees burn in response to climate change, and trees grow very, very slowly as well. So putting all our efforts on this is not going to be enough. We absolutely need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases at the very source for the problem of climate change. But for all of the people watching us tonight, why should they care so much about geoengineering? Because, they're already feeling the pressure, the eco-anxiety, the pressure of trying to be better, of reducing their environmental footprint. But should they worry about geoengineering if it's not going to happen? Is it going to happen?
This is the main point. I think the main point of this is why I wrote an article. This is why I'm happy to discuss it today, and I want to keep discussing it. Is I think we need to raise awareness. I think people need to know what's happening. They need to know for several reasons. First, because as I said, it's dangerous technology. Potentially, I'm not saying we should, just erase any research program because I think it's still useful. But we need to be aware this happening and there are some dangers. Second, industries are going to try to use these technologies as an easy way out of the responsibility. And this is something we all need to be aware of, because if there is no accountability, they're going to do it secretly. So we need to be able to prevent them from just finding this easy way out of, I can still, use oil because I can just compensate. Then I think it's something more interesting. I think it's fascinating for me because I'm doing some research, but we are observing the privatization of research. When you have a startup like Make Sense that is running this sort of experiment without any scientific scrutiny without any agreement from the government. They said it. They said they wanted to be provocative. I think this is very scary because if you have a privatization of research, you also have a trust issue. Are you going to trust a startup telling you these technologies are great when you know that this same startup is trying to sell you cooling credits, which means they're going to sell to companies a credit for $10, approximately the equivalent of ton of CO2. I mean, I'm not going to believe them because they are doing it for commercial reasons. And it's the same with the carbon capture. There was also an interesting report saying that, a British report, actually a lot of the gas that is captured in the air and it is put back in the soil is used to help squeeze out the last drop of oil, sometimes in some oil fields. So it's not even working in some cases. And then another point I think is very important for people watching this live is the governance issue. If people are not aware of a situation, they're not going to be bothered about governance. But governance is the key to any decision-making in our systems. And I mean, democratically, we could ask a question, who should make the decision with solar engineering? Who should decide whether we should do it? How much we should spray? How many particles? How often? What is the target in terms of temperature? Where we should spray the particles? And I think if there is no debate about this, then it's not going to happen. If it happens, imagine someday, we're never going to notice it. And if we notice it, we're not even going to be aware of who is taking the decision. And it's leading me to a last point. I don't want to be too frightening, but there's also a geopolitical issue. Actually, there is a book about it, which is called Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson that you could read. It's an insane book. But the idea is that solar geoengineering could lead to massive geopolitical issues. Imagine, say, India and Pakistan disagree over one doing this and the other one not doing this, or the US and China. Or imagine a country decide to weaponize, spraying a lot of particles above a country, so then suddenly there is a change of climate. I think, I don't want to be too scary. I'm not a collapsologist. I'm not saying this is the end of our world. But if people don't understand what's happening, they're going to let it go. And then we're going to be in massive, massive troubles.
Yeah, this is quite sobering, but it's true. I mean, to see that a startup like Make Sense, it was able to do it, because there were no regulations. Apparently now everything has been blocked since that event. But it's very scary. I know quite a few programs are working on the possibility of refreezing the Arctic, for example. This is where I am today. We know the Arctic is warming very, very quickly. We also know there are 7 million inhabitants up here. Okay? So who would decide, whether or not, the Arctic doesn't deserve that much sunlight anymore? Let's refreeze it. It will be better for the rest of the planet. So there is definitely a huge issue of governance here. But please give us some hope now. Is there anything that we can do about this at our level? I know you're an expert, you're working on this topic, but what can people who are watching tonight, what can they do about it, apart from learning more about geoengineering?
So it's always tricky to think about what an individual can do, because we shouldn't be, we should be realistic about the situation. We don't always have the power to do everything. But as we saw with the climate strike, or, actually a lot of social movements, we have a social movement today in France, social movements are able to drive change. If a government believes that their people don't really care about a solution or about climate change, they're not going to do anything about it. If we are raising awareness and people try to understand what's happening, they can later on put pressure on the governments in terms of voting, in terms of protest, in terms of, lobbying, advocacy with association, etc. And the message I want every person to have in mind when they finish this live, and then, if they bring it to the government, is first, we need to rely on the precautionary approach. I think this is something we discuss a lot in Europe, and we don't discuss it that much with these technologies. We shouldn't invest in something if there is a significant risk for our health, the Earth system. Second, we need regulations. I mean, it's not the Far West here. We need to ban private investment in this type of, technologies, and we need to prevent companies from being able potentially to use fake offsets. Then, and this is something I debated with myself, should we at least do some research? I think the answer is probably yes. We still need to do some public research because we can't ignore that it's happening. So I'm not saying let's close everything, let's just not discuss it anymore. It's like, a Voldemort in Harry Potter, we can still say its name. So I think it shouldn't become a solution, but if we don't understand it and someday maybe an autocratic regime starts using it and we're not prepared, then we're going to be in even bigger trouble. So I think we are lagging behind in terms of understanding, and we need public research very controlled research to at least understand what's happening, how the system is reacting. So if one day some company, some country decide to use it, we know what's happening. Then we, of course, need to discuss the governance, I think, together to decide, who should have the technology. If there is a technology one day, how do we do if there is a catastrophe some places because they use this technology? I think this is something we need to discuss. And then finally, this is, I think, it was the point of my article when I wrote it, is techno-solutionism. We shouldn't blindly believe in technology. And I think this is a word for every citizen. Sometimes we might be tempted to believe that technology is going to save us. Technology is part of the answer. Solar panels are heavy technologies, wind farms, e-vehicles, all of these are very useful technologies. But we shouldn't be blind about these technologies. Renewable energies are going to be very useful, but because they come as a complement with mitigation policies, frugality, reduction of consumption. So I think the message is don't be blind with technology. Technology is not going to save us. It's going to be part of the answer. The other part is mitigation, mitigation, mitigation.
And that's quite empowering, I think, for the people watching this tonight also, to use your voice and make sure you have your BS radar on at all times, because there's definitely a lot of this at the moment. Thank you so much, Théodore. This has been so insightful. I really appreciate your time. I was wondering, where can people follow your work? Because you seem to be doing a lot of things that are absolutely fascinating, including following geoengineering. What's the best way to follow what you do?
The two best way would be probably, I am on Twitter, so people can follow me on Twitter, Théodore Tallent, but a lot of my posts are actually happening on LinkedIn because I think it's better to have some time to actually tell a story instead of having a couple of tweets. So Twitter or LinkedIn, don't hesitate.
Perfect. We'll do that, everyone. Going to follow him on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Well, thank you again so very much for your time, and thank you everyone for watching tonight. We're continuing these lives, so please, if you have any suggestions, including you, Théodore, anything that you think we should be focusing on, please let us know. If you want a part 2 with Théodore, also let us know. I think there's so much to unpack with geoengineering, but we'll certainly keep in touch with you and know how the field of geoengineering is evolving. And I wish you a fantastic rest of your day. Let's keep in touch and watch this space for future live streams. Théodore, thank you so much.